I was 12 years old when I first understood that the dead do not leave us, and I was 24 when a man who despised me knelt at my feet and wept because he finally believed me. This is the story of how I became a madwoman, a bride, and a queen of ghosts, and how the cruelest wager in London society became the truest love I have ever known. My name is Isolde Ashworth, and I remember the precise moment my life cleaved into before and after. It was the morning of my mother's funeral, a grey November day in 1870, and I stood in the drawing room of our Mayfair townhouse, watching her spirit smooth the hair of her own corpse. She looked up at me with such tenderness, such sorrow, and she spoke my name. I answered her. I told her I could see her, that I loved her, that I did not want her to go. My father entered the room and found me conversing with empty air, my hands extended toward nothing, tears streaming down my face as I begged my mother's ghost to stay. He did not strike me. He did not shout. He simply looked at me with an expression I would come to know well in the years that followed, an expression of horrified pity, and he said, very quietly, that I was unwell. That grief had broken something in my mind, that I would need help. The help arrived 3 days after we buried my mother. It came in the form of a private carriage and 2 men in dark coats, and it took me to Holloway Asylum, where I would spend the next 3 years learning that the worst prison is not made of stone walls, but of the certainty that no one will ever believe you. I will not dwell on those years. I will not describe the treatments, the cold baths, the restraints, the hours spent staring at whitewashed walls while doctors asked me again and again if I still saw things that were not there. I learned eventually to lie. I learned to say that I had been mistaken, that grief had confused me, that I no longer saw my mother or anyone else who had died. I learned to keep my eyes fixed straight ahead when spirits drifted past me in the corridors, to swallow my screams when the ghost of a woman who had died in my very bed sat beside me at night and wept. I was released when I was 15, pronounced cured, and returned to a world that no longer had a place for me. My father had remarried. His new wife, a woman of impeccable reputation and limited imagination, made it clear that my presence in their home was an embarrassment. She was a widow, named Mrs. Henrietta Fairfax before she became the second Mrs. Ashworth, and she brought with her 2 daughters of her own, pretty, simpering girls who looked at me as though I might bite them at any moment. My stepmother never spoke of my time at Holloway, but she did not need to. It was there in every glance, every careful silence, every time she ushered her daughters from the room when I entered. I was tainted, ruined, a stain on the family name that no amount of denial could erase. I was sent to live with my mother's brother, a distant and distracted man named Uncle Horace who owned a crumbling estate in Derbyshire and wanted nothing more than to be left alone with his books and his hunting dogs. He was not cruel, my uncle, merely indifferent. He provided me with food and shelter and the bare minimum of education, and in return I stayed out of his way and made no demands on his attention. The estate, Ashworth Grange, had been grand once in my grandfather's time, but years of neglect had taken their toll. The east wing was closed off entirely, its rooms thick with dust and cobwebs, its furniture draped in white sheets like shrouded corpses. The gardens had grown wild, hedges swallowing pathways, rose bushes run riot until they resembled thorny walls. There was a lake, too, a dark and silent stretch of water at the far edge of the grounds, and sometimes I would sit on its muddy shore and watch the mist rise from its surface and imagine that I could hear voices in the whisper of the reeds. The servants were few and overworked, and they regarded me with a mixture of pity and unease. They knew, of course, everyone knew. The mad Ashworth girl, the one who had been sent away. They whispered about me in the kitchens, fell silent when I entered a room, made the sign against evil when they thought I was not watching. I learned to pretend I did not notice, learned to walk through the house with my head high and my face serene, learned to swallow the loneliness that threatened to choke me. And so I grew up in the forgotten wing of Ashworth Grange, tended by servants who whispered about me when they thought I could not hear, visited twice a year by a father who looked at me as though I were a wound that had never quite healed. He would arrive in his fine carriage, spend exactly 2 hours in my uncle's study drinking brandy and discussing business, and then depart without ever seeking me out. Sometimes I would watch from an upper window as his carriage disappeared down the drive, and I would wonder if he even remembered that I existed. The ghosts at Ashworth Grange were quieter than the ones at Holloway, but they were there nonetheless. An old woman who wandered the kitchens at night, searching for something she could never find. A young man in outdated clothes who stood at the window of the east wing and stared out at the lake with such terrible longing. A child, a little girl no more than 4 or 5, who played in the overgrown gardens and laughed at jokes I could not hear. I learned their stories over time. The old woman had been a cook who died of a fever in the winter of 1802, leaving behind a husband and 3 children she had never said goodbye to. The young man had drowned in the lake, a suspected suicide after his sweetheart married another. The child had wandered away from her nurse one summer afternoon and was never seen alive again, her body found days later beneath the willow trees. I could not help them, I did not know how, but I could see them. And sometimes I think that was enough, to be seen, to be acknowledged, to know that someone remembered they had existed. It was more than the living ever gave me. I learned to manage my gift in solitude. I learned which spirits wanted only to be seen, which wanted to speak, and which wanted something more. I learned to walk through a room full of the dead, with my face composed and my hands steady, to nod politely at presences no one else could perceive, to carry on conversations in my mind while my lips remained sealed. By the time I was 21, I had accepted that I would never marry, never have children, never take my place in the society that had rejected me. I was the mad Ashworth girl, the one who had been sent away, the one who still was not quite right. Mothers steered their daughters away from me at the rare social gatherings I attended. Gentlemen looked through me as though I were made of glass. I existed in a kind of half-life, neither fully present nor fully absent, a ghost myself in all but flesh. And then, in the spring of 1882, a letter arrived that would change everything. It was addressed to my uncle, but he was away on one of his interminable hunting trips, gone for 3 weeks already, with no indication of when he might return. The housekeeper, a severe woman named Mrs. Blackett, who had been with the family since before I was born, brought it to me with a puzzled expression. The seal was unfamiliar, a rampant lion clutching a sword, and when I broke it and unfolded the heavy cream paper, I found myself reading a proposal of marriage. The letter was brief and businesslike, written in a strong, slanting hand that spoke of impatience and authority. Lord Sebastian Vane, Marquess of Dunmorrow, had heard of my situation and wished to offer me the protection of his name and the comfort of his home. He understood that my circumstances were unusual. He did not require a love match. He asked only for a wife who would fulfill the basic duties of her station and cause him no trouble. In return, he would provide me with a generous allowance, complete freedom within the bounds of propriety, and a life far removed from the whispers and pity that had followed me since childhood. I read the letter 3 times, searching for the trick, the trap, the hidden cruelty. I knew of Lord Dunmorrow, as did everyone in England. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, heir to an ancient title and a vast estate in the north. He was also, by all accounts, one of the coldest. The society papers called him the Marble Marquess, a man of cutting wit and colder heart, famous for his disdain of sentiment and his ruthless treatment of anyone who bored him. He had never married, though he was past 30, and the gossips whispered that he was incapable of love, that something in him had frozen solid long ago, and would never thaw. There were other rumors, too, darker ones, that his mother had been mad, had seen things that were not there, had walked into the sea one November night and never walked out again, that his father had died of grief less than a year later, leaving the 8-year-old Sebastian to be raised by servants and solicitors, that there was something wrong with the family, something inherited, something that could not be cured. I should have been repulsed by these whispers. Instead, I found myself intrigued. A mother who saw things, a family marked by tragedy and mystery, a man who had grown up alone in a great house, learning to hide his heart behind walls of ice. It sounded, in a strange and troubling way, like my own story. Why would such a man want me? I wrote to my father, asking for his advice. His response came within the week, terse and dismissive. He saw no reason to refuse such an advantageous match. If the marquess was willing to take me off the family's hands, I should be grateful for the opportunity. He would not stand in the way. I wrote to my stepmother, hoping for some feminine insight. She did not respond at all. And so, alone in my room at Ashworth Grange, with the spring rain beating against the windows and the ghost of the drowned young man watching from the corner, I made my decision. I should have refused. I should have sent the letter back unopened, should have trusted the instinct that told me something was deeply wrong. But I was so tired. Tired of being pitied, tired of being invisible, tired of watching my youth slip away in a house where no one wanted me. And beneath the exhaustion, beneath the caution, there was something else. A flicker of curiosity about this man who had chosen me, of all the women in England, to bear his name. I wrote back and accepted. We were married 6 weeks later in a small church in London, with no guests save my uncle, who looked relieved to be rid of me, and 2 witnesses I had never met. The church was St. Clement's in the Strand, a dark and ancient building that smelled of candle wax and cold stone. There were no flowers, no music, no joyful bells, just the vicar's droning voice and the echo of our vows against the vaulted ceiling. Lord Dunmorrow, my husband, stood beside me at the altar with an expression of perfect indifference, his dark eyes fixed on some point above my head, his voice flat and uninflected as he spoke his vows. He was tall, taller than I had expected, with black hair silvered at the temples despite his relative youth, and a face that might have been handsome if it had ever shown a flicker of warmth. His jaw was strong, his cheekbones sharp, his nose straight and aristocratic. But it was his eyes that held me, dark as ink, deep as wells, and utterly, terrifyingly empty. His hand, when he took mine to slide the ring onto my finger, was as cold as marble. I wore a gray traveling dress, the nicest thing I owned, and a small bonnet that had belonged to my mother. I had no trousseau, no dowry, nothing but a trunk of worn clothes and a handful of books, and the gift that had ruined my life. Lord Dunmorrow had not asked for anything, and I had not offered. We were not marrying for love or money or alliance. We were marrying because he had decided we would, and I had decided to let him. We did not speak in the carriage that carried us away from the church. The streets of London slid past the windows, grey and grimy in the spring drizzle, and I watched the faces of strangers and wondered if any of them could guess what had just happened. A marquess had married a madwoman. The gossip sheets would be delirious with speculation. We did not speak over the wedding breakfast, a silent and joyless affair in a private dining room at his London townhouse. The house was grand, of course, all marble floors and gilded ceilings and portraits of stern ancestors glaring down from the walls. Servants moved silently around us, pouring wine we did not drink, serving food we did not eat. I caught them watching me with poorly concealed curiosity, no doubt wondering what kind of creature their master had brought home. It was only when we boarded the train that would carry us north to Dunmorrow Hall that he finally addressed me directly. The train was a private car, reserved for our exclusive use, furnished with velvet seats and polished wood and a small table set with crystal glasses. My husband sat opposite me, his long legs stretched out before him, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside. Fields and farms and small villages slid past, growing wilder and more rugged as we traveled north. The sky darkened from gray to slate to charcoal, and rain began to streak the windows. "You understand?" he said at last. his voice breaking the silence like a stone dropped into still water, that this is an arrangement of convenience. I expect nothing from you but discretion. You will have your own rooms, your own servants, your own life. We need not trouble each other more than necessary. I nodded, though he was not looking at me to see it. His profile was sharp against the window, like a face carved in stone. I asked him why he had chosen me, why he had sought out the mad Ashworth girl when he could have had any woman in England. For a long moment he did not answer. The train rattled and swayed, and the rain drummed against the glass, and I began to think he had not heard me or had chosen not to respond. Then he turned his head, and I saw something flicker in those cold, dark eyes, something that might have been amusement or might have been contempt, because, he said, you have nothing to lose. And neither, Miss Ashworth, do I. He called me Miss Ashworth, not Lady Dunmorrow, not even Mrs. Vane, as though the marriage had not happened, as though I were still the discarded spinster I had been that morning. I felt the first stirring of anger, hot and unfamiliar, and I held it close. I would need it, I suspected, in the days to come. The journey took nearly 8 hours, with one change of trains at a small station in Yorkshire. By the time we reached our destination, a tiny village called Dunmorrow by the sea, night had fallen, and the rain had turned to a thick, driving mist. A carriage waited for us on the platform, black and gleaming, drawn by 4 black horses that stamped and snorted in the damp air. A coachman in livery helped me inside, and my husband climbed in after me, and we set off into the darkness. I could see nothing through the windows, nothing but the mist and the faint glow of the carriage lamps. But I could feel something, a presence, a weight, growing heavier with every mile we traveled. The dead were near, many of them, more than I had ever sensed in one place. I kept my hands folded in my lap and my face still, but inside my heart was racing. The carriage climbed, the road growing steeper and rougher, the horses straining against the incline. I heard the crash of waves somewhere below us, the cry of seabirds, the whistle of wind through unseen trees. And then, quite suddenly, we emerged from the mist, and I saw it. Dunmorrow Hall. Dunmorrow Hall revealed itself as the sun was setting, a vast Gothic edifice of grey stone and black windows perched on a cliff above a churning sea. It was beautiful in the way that storms are beautiful, in the way that wolves are beautiful, a beauty that warned of danger even as it drew the eye. The house was enormous, far larger than I had imagined. It sprawled across the cliff top like a great stone beast, its towers and turrets and chimneys reaching toward the darkening sky. Gargoyles crouched at the corners of the roof, their faces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Ivy crawled up the walls, thick and dark, and somewhere within those walls, a light burned in a single window, small and yellow against the gray. The carriage wound up a long drive lined with ancient oaks, their branches bare and grasping against the orange sky. And I felt the first whisper of something I had not felt since childhood. Not just the presence of the dead, but something older, something that had been waiting here for a very long time. I kept my face still as the carriage stopped before the great front doors, as liveried footmen hurried to help me down, as an elderly butler named Graves welcomed me with a bow and an expression of carefully veiled curiosity. My husband strode ahead of me into the entrance hall, issuing orders in that flat, cold voice, and I followed slowly, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. The entrance hall was vast, rising 3 stories to a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. A grand staircase swept upward to a gallery lined with portraits, and everywhere I looked, I saw wealth and age and careful preservation. The floor was black and white marble, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. A fireplace large enough to roast an ox dominated one wall, though no fire burned within it. Candelabras stood on every surface, their candles unlit, their brass fixtures gleaming dully in the fading light. And the ghosts. I saw them at once, though I had trained myself not to react. A woman in Elizabethan dress drifting past the fireplace, her ruff high and white around her pale face. A man in a powdered wig standing at the foot of the stairs, his coat embroidered with gold thread that no longer shimmered. A child, no more than 5 or 6, peering at me from behind a marble column, her eyes wide and curious. They were watching me, all of them, watching with an intensity that made my skin prickle and my heart race. I had been seen by ghosts before, had grown accustomed to their attention. But this was different. This was not idle curiosity. This was recognition. "Welcome, Lady Dunmorrow," Graves said, gesturing toward the stairs. His voice was deep and formal, with the faint burr of a northern accent. "His lordship has asked that you be shown to your rooms. Dinner will be served at 8. I thanked him and followed a housemaid up the grand staircase, past the gallery of portraits, where generations of Vanes stared down at me with painted eyes, down a long corridor lined with closed doors. The corridor was dark, lit only by occasional gas lamps that cast flickering pools of yellow light. The carpet beneath my feet was thick and soft, muffling my footsteps. The walls were hung with tapestries, ancient things depicting hunts and battles, and scenes I did not recognize. With every step, I felt the presence of the dead growing stronger, felt their attention focusing on me like sunlight through a lens. The Elizabethan woman drifted beside me for a few yards before fading into a wall. The child appeared at the end of the corridor, watching me approach with those wide, solemn eyes, then vanished as I drew near. Others appeared and disappeared, too many to count, too many to name, a constant procession of spirits that seemed to grow more numerous the deeper I ventured into the house. By the time we reached my rooms, a suite of chambers overlooking the sea, my hands were trembling. The suite was beautiful, I had to admit. A sitting room with windows facing west, where the last light of the sun painted the waves in shades of gold and crimson. A bedroom with a 4-poster bed hung with blue velvet curtains, its mattress thick with feather pillows. A dressing room with a large mirror and a wardrobe that could have held the clothes of a dozen women. A small private bathroom with running water, a luxury I had not known at Ashworth Grange. The maid, a young woman named Annie with red hair and a scattering of freckles across her nose, helped me out of my traveling dress and into something more suitable for dinner. She chattered as she worked, telling me about the house and its history, the servants and their duties, the village below the cliffs and its fishermen and farmers. I listened and nodded and asked the occasional question, but most of my attention was focused on the window, on the sea beyond, on the strange pull I felt toward the darkness gathering outside. When Annie left me alone to rest before dinner, I did not rest. I stood at the window and watched the last light fade over the water, watched the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky, watched the waves crash against the rocks below with a sound like distant thunder. And I told myself that I was not afraid. I had lived with the dead all my life. I had learned to coexist with them, to give them what comfort I could without losing myself in their needs and sorrows. This was no different. But it was different. I could feel it in the air, in the way the shadows seemed to lean toward me, in the faint whisper that might have been wind or might have been voices. Something was waiting in this house, something that had been waiting for a very long time, and whatever it was, it knew I had arrived. Dinner was served in a cavernous dining room, my husband at one end of a table that could have seated 30, myself at the other. The distance between us was vast, not just in feet but in feeling. We might as well have been strangers dining in separate rooms. The room itself was magnificent, if oppressive. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines and strange watching faces. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, dripping with crystals that caught the candlelight and scattered it in rainbow fragments across the white tablecloth. Portraits of long-dead Vanes lined the walls, their eyes following me as the footmen served course after course of food I could barely taste. We ate in silence, served by footmen who moved like ghosts themselves, appearing and disappearing without a sound. I studied my husband's face in the candlelight and tried to understand the man I had married. He ate mechanically, without apparent pleasure, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. Once I caught him glancing at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in his expression, something curious, almost questioning. But then the mask slipped back into place, and he returned his attention to his plate. The food was excellent, I supposed, though I could barely taste it. Soup, then fish, then beef, then pudding, each course presented with elaborate ceremony and consumed in silence. By the time the servants cleared the final plates, I was exhausted. Not from the food, but from the effort of sitting there pretending that everything was normal, that I had not just married a stranger, that the house around us was not teeming with the restless dead. After dinner, he rose and informed me that he had business to attend to in his study. He bid me good night with a curt nod and left me alone in the vast, echoing room. I did not go to my chambers. Instead, I wandered the ground floor of Dunmorrow Hall, drifting from room to room like the spirits that drifted beside me. The library was my first discovery, and it took my breath away. 3 stories of books rose around me, shelf upon shelf of leather-bound volumes, reaching toward a domed glass ceiling. Ladders on brass rails allowed access to the upper shelves, and comfortable chairs were scattered throughout, positioned near fireplaces and windows, inviting long hours of reading. The air smelled of old paper and leather and dust, and despite everything, I felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. If nothing else, I would not lack for reading material. From the library, I found my way to the music room, where a grand piano sat silent beneath a shroud of white cloth. I lifted the cloth and ran my fingers along the keys, producing a discordant jangle that made me wince. The room was cold, the fireplace dark, and I could see my breath misting in the air. But the cold was not merely physical. There was something here, some presence, some memory of music and laughter that had long since faded. The conservatory came next, its glass walls fogged with condensation, its exotic plants grown wild and strange. Orchids and ferns and palms crowded together in the humid air, reaching toward the little light that penetrated the clouded glass. It was like stepping into another world, a jungle hidden within the heart of this cold stone house. I wandered the paths between the plants, brushing my fingers against leaves and petals, and I wondered who had tended this place, who had loved it, and why it had been allowed to fall into such beautiful decay. Everywhere I went, the dead followed. They did not speak to me, not yet, but they watched with those hungry, hopeful eyes, and I felt the weight of their attention like a hand pressed against my chest. Some were curious, drifting close to examine my face, my dress, the ring upon my finger. Others were wary, keeping their distance, watching from the shadows. A few seemed almost eager, pressing forward as though they wanted to speak but could not find the words. It was nearly midnight when I found myself in the great hall again, standing before the cold fireplace, staring up at the portrait that hung above the mantel. It showed a woman in a dark gown, her face pale and lovely, her eyes fixed on something beyond the frame. Her hair was dark, like mine, and her features had a delicate, almost ethereal quality. But it was her eyes that held me, dark and deep and filled with a sorrow that seemed to reach across the years. There was something familiar about her, something that tugged at my memory, but I could not place it. "She was my mother," said a voice behind me. I turned and found my husband standing in the doorway, a glass of brandy in his hand, his face half hidden in shadow. He had removed his coat and cravat, and in the dim light he looked younger, less forbidding, almost human. His shirt was open at the throat, revealing a glimpse of pale skin, and his hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it. "She died when I was 7, he continued, crossing the room to stand beside me. His footsteps were silent on the thick carpet. My father followed her a year later. I have been master of this house since I was 8 years old. I looked up at the portrait again, at those lovely, haunted eyes, and I said that she must have been very beautiful. She was mad, my husband said flatly. Or so they said. She saw things that were not there, heard voices in the walls. The doctors tried everything, but in the end, she walked into the sea and did not come back. The words hit me like a blow. I turned to look at him, searching his face for mockery or cruelty. But there was only that same cold blankness, that same careful absence of feeling. His jaw was tight, and I could see a muscle jumping beneath the skin. "Is that why you married me?" I asked. "Because your mother was like me?" For a long moment, he did not answer. The fire crackled in a nearby room, and somewhere in the house, a clock began to chime midnight, its tone deep and mournful. Then he laughed, a short, bitter sound that held no humor, and drained his brandy in a single swallow. "I married you, Miss Ashworth, because I was dared to. Because my friends at the club wagered £1,000 that I could not take the maddest woman in England and make her my wife for a year. Because I am a fool and a bastard, and I have never been able to resist a challenge." The honesty was so unexpected, so brutal, that I could not speak. I stood there staring at him, my heart pounding, my mind racing, and I watched something shift in his expression, something that might have been shame. His eyes dropped from mine, and he turned to stare into the empty fireplace. "You should know what you are," he said quietly. "You should know that this marriage is a joke, a game, a way for bored aristocrats to amuse themselves. I have no intention of being a husband to you in any real sense. But I will keep my word. You will have your allowance, your freedom, your life. And at the end of the year, when the wager is won, we can discuss what comes next." He turned to leave, and I found my voice at last. "I am not mad," I said. He paused in the doorway, his back to me. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the stiffness of his spine. "My mother was not mad either," I continued, and my voice was steady now, steady and clear. "She saw things, real things. And so do I. I have seen them all my life since I was a child. I see them now in this house. They are everywhere, Lord Dunmorrow. They are watching us as we speak." He did not turn around. He stood very still for a long moment, and I could see his hands clench and unclench at his sides. Then he said, in a voice I had not heard before, a voice that was almost gentle, "You should get some rest, Lady Dunmorrow. The journey was long, and you are tired." And then he was gone, and I was alone in the great hall with the portrait of his dead mother and the spirits that pressed close around me, waiting, waiting, waiting. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my unfamiliar bed, the blue velvet curtains drawn close around me, and listened to the wind howl outside my window and the house creak and settle around me. The sound of the sea was constant, a low roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and I tried to make sense of what I had learned. A wager. I was a wager, a prize in some cruel game played by men who had never known a moment of true suffering in their lives. The thought should have devastated me. It should have sent me fleeing back to my uncle's house, back to my half-life of pity and neglect. But instead, I felt something unexpected. I felt relief. My husband did not want me. He did not love me, did not desire me, did not expect anything from me but my presence. And in that absence of expectation, I found a strange kind of freedom. I could be myself here, truly myself, in a way I had never been allowed to be before. I could walk among the dead without fear of discovery, could speak to them, help them, finally use my gift for something other than my own survival. The thought was liberating in a way I had not anticipated. For the first time in my life, I was not trying to hide what I was. My husband already thought I was mad. The servants already whispered about me. There was no reputation to protect, no pretense to maintain. I could simply be Isolde, seer of spirits, bride of the marble marquess, and see where the path led. And beneath the relief, beneath the cold clarity of understanding, there was something else. A curiosity about the man who had chosen me for a wager but had felt compelled to tell me the truth. A fascination with the shadows in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way he had spoken of his mother with such careful absence of emotion. He was hiding something. Something beyond the wager, beyond the cold facade he showed the world. And I, who had spent my whole life learning to see what others could not, found myself wondering what secrets lay buried in the heart of the marble marquess. Dawn came slowly, the gray light creeping through the gap in my curtains and painting pale stripes across the floor. I rose and dressed without calling for Annie, choosing a simple morning dress that would allow me to move freely. I had a house to explore, spirits to understand, and a mystery to unravel. There was no time for elaborate toilette. The corridors of Dunmorrow Hall were quiet in the early morning, the servants not yet about their duties, the house still wrapped in the hush of sleep. I walked softly, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, and I let my senses expand, reaching out to the dead who lingered here. They were everywhere. In every room, every corridor, every alcove and corner, I found them. Some were clear and distinct, their features sharp, their clothing detailed. Others were faint, mere wisps of presence, shadows of shadows. Some noticed me as I passed, turning to watch with those hollow eyes. Others seemed lost in their own memories, repeating actions they had performed in life, unaware that centuries had passed since their last breath. I counted them as I walked. The Elizabethan woman I had seen the night before, drifting through the entrance hall, a group of servants in Georgian dress clustered in a doorway as though gossiping. A soldier in a red coat, his chest stained with what might have been blood, standing at attention near a window. A young woman in a wedding gown, her face pale and tear-streaked, wringing her hands before a mirror. By the time I completed my circuit of the ground floor, I had counted 47 distinct spirits, and I knew there were more in the upper stories, more in the towers and attics and cellars I had not yet explored. 47. At least 47 people had died in this house and remained trapped here, unable to move on, unable to find peace. It was more than I had ever encountered anywhere, more than I had ever imagined possible. And I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones like cold, that this was not natural. This was not simply a very old house with a very long history. Something was keeping them here. Something was binding them to this place, preventing them from moving on to whatever came next. And whatever that something was, it had been doing so for a very long time. The next morning, I began my exploration of Dunmorrow Hall in earnest. My husband had retreated to his study before breakfast and showed no inclination to emerge, so I was free to wander as I pleased, accompanied only by the ever-present spirits who drifted through the corridors like autumn leaves. I started with the public rooms on the ground floor, the ones I had glimpsed the night before. The library drew me first, and I spent several hours browsing its shelves, marveling at the breadth and depth of the collection. There were books on every subject imaginable: philosophy and science, history and geography, poetry and fiction, medicine and law. There were volumes in English and French and Latin and Greek, some so old that their bindings crumbled at my touch, others so new that their pages were still uncut. In a locked glass case, I found something that made my heart beat faster: a collection of books on spiritualism and the occult, treatises on ghosts and hauntings, guides to communicating with the dead, accounts of famous mediums and their seances. Some were scholarly, written by scientists and philosophers. Others were sensational, filled with lurid illustrations and breathless accounts of supernatural encounters. I did not try to open the case, not yet, but I noted its location and resolved to return when I had the chance. From the library, I moved to the east wing of the house, where the older, less used rooms were located. Here, the ghosts were thicker, the air heavy with their presence. I passed through a succession of drawing rooms and sitting rooms, each more elaborate than the last, each filled with furniture draped in white sheets and paintings covered with cloth. It was like walking through a gallery of memories, a museum of lives that had been lived and lost. In one room, I found a ghost I had not seen before. A woman in a pale pink gown, seated at a writing desk, her pen moving across invisible paper. She looked up as I entered, and her face lit with surprise. "You can see me," she said, and her voice was like the whisper of wind through dead leaves. I nodded, keeping my own voice low. "I can see you. I have always been able to see those who have passed." The woman rose from her chair and drifted toward me, her form growing more distinct as she approached. She was young, perhaps my own age, with fair hair and blue eyes and a sweet, gentle face that reminded me of the portraits I had seen in the gallery. "We have waited so long," she said, "so many years. We hoped, when his lordship married, that perhaps his bride would be the one. But the others could not see us. The others were blind." "Others?" I asked. "There have been other brides?" The ghost shook her head. "Not brides. Women. He has brought women here before, companions, mistresses, ladies of society. We hoped that one of them might have the sight. But none of them did. None of them could see us." I felt a chill run through me. "How long have you been waiting?" The ghost was silent for a moment, her expression troubled. "I do not know," she admitted. "Time moves strangely here. It seems like an eternity, and yet also like no time at all. I remember when I died. I remember the pain, the fear, the darkness. And then I was here, trapped, unable to leave, unable to find peace. And so I have remained, ever since." "What is keeping you here?" I asked. "Why cannot you move on?" The ghost's face twisted with sorrow. "The curse," she whispered. "The curse that lies on this house. We are bound here, all of us, trapped by the wrong that was done long ago. We cannot leave, cannot rest, cannot find peace. We have been prisoners for generations, and we have no hope of release unless—" She faltered, her form growing thin and insubstantial. "Unless what?" I pressed. "Unless the compact is broken," she whispered. "Unless the wrong is made right. Unless someone living sees us, hears us, and helps us." And then she was gone, fading away like mist in sunlight, leaving me alone with my questions and the growing certainty that I had stumbled into something far larger and darker than I had ever imagined. I found my husband in his study that night, hunched over a desk covered in papers, a glass of brandy at his elbow. The room was smaller than I had expected, intimate almost, lined with books and maps and the accumulated debris of a life spent managing a great estate. A fire burned in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and the air smelled of tobacco and leather, and something else, something sharp and sad. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment I saw surprise in his eyes, surprise in something that might have been fear. Then the cold mask slipped back into place, and he was the marble marquess again, distant and untouchable. "Lady Dunmorrow," he said flatly, "is there something you require?" I told him I required answers. I told him about the ghost I had seen in the East Wing, about her words, about the curse she had mentioned. I described her appearance, the pink gown, the fair hair, the gentle face. I watched his face as I spoke, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his hands tighten on the arms of his chair until his knuckles went white. "You are imagining things," he said when I had finished, but his voice was not steady. His eyes darted to the door, then to the window, then back to me. I told him I was not imagining anything. I told him I had been seeing the dead since I was a child, that they were as real to me as he was, that I had spent my entire life being told I was mad when I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was not. I told him about my mother, about the asylum, about the years of silence and denial. I told him everything, things I had never told another living soul, and I watched his face as the truth settled over him like a shroud. He rose from his chair and crossed to the window, his back to me. The firelight played across his shoulders, and I could see the tension in every line of his body. For a long moment, he was silent, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My mother saw them too," he said. She told me about them when I was very young, before I learned to dismiss her words as madness. She said the house was full of ghosts, that they followed her everywhere, that they wanted something from her that she could not give. She said they spoke to her at night, told her secrets, begged her for help. I thought she was ill. I thought she was broken. I was a child and I did not understand. He paused, his hands pressed flat against the cold glass of the window. And then she walked into the sea, and I told myself that she had been suffering, that death had been a mercy. I told myself that there were no ghosts, no curses, no supernatural forces at work. I told myself that she had simply been sick, that her mind had betrayed her, that what happened to her could not happen to me as long as I remained rational, remained in control. He turned to face me, and I saw that his eyes were wet. In the firelight, he looked very young, very lost, and my heart clenched with an emotion I had not expected to feel. But sometimes, he continued, late at night, when the house is quiet, I hear things. Footsteps in empty corridors, whispers in rooms where no one stands. I see movements out of the corner of my eye, shapes that vanish when I turn to look. I tell myself it is the wind, the old timbers settling, my own imagination. But part of me has always wondered if she was right, if the ghosts are real, if she was not mad at all, but simply cursed to see what the rest of us cannot. I crossed the room and stood before him, close enough to touch, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his pulse beat in his throat. She was not mad, I said, and neither am I. I can prove it to you if you will let me. He looked down at me, and I saw the war in his eyes, the desperate hope battling against a lifetime of denial. I saw the boy who had lost his mother, the man who had built walls around his heart to protect himself from the pain. How? He asked, and his voice cracked on the word. I told him to come with me. I told him to follow me into the great hall and watch. He hesitated for a long moment, and I saw the fear flicker across his face. This was a man who had spent his entire adult life denying the supernatural, protecting himself from the truth that had destroyed his mother. To follow me now, to let me show him what I could do, was to risk everything he had built, every wall he had constructed, every lie he had told himself to survive. But he came. He set down his brandy glass, squared his shoulders, and followed me out of the study and down the corridor to the great hall. We walked together through the dark corridors of Dunmorrow Hall, our footsteps echoing on the ancient stone floors. The house was silent around us, the servants long since retired, and the only light came from the candelabra my husband carried, its flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The shadows seemed alive somehow, reaching and grasping at our passing figures, and I felt the spirits stir as we walked, felt their attention sharpen like a blade being drawn from its sheath. When we reached the great hall, I asked him to set down the candelabra and stand beside me. He did so, his face pale and set, his jaw clenched as though he were bracing for a blow. I could see his hands trembling despite his efforts to hide them, and I felt an unexpected surge of tenderness for this proud, frightened man. I closed my eyes and reached out with my gift, that strange sense that had been with me since childhood. Not with words, but with intention, with willingness, with an openness that I had learned to cultivate over years of solitary practice. I let down the barriers I usually kept in place, the walls that protected me from being overwhelmed by the dead, and I called to them. They came, one by one at first, then in pairs, then in groups, then in waves. They emerged from the shadows, from the walls, from the very stones beneath our feet. The Elizabethan woman I had seen before, her ruff glowing faintly in the darkness. The man in the powdered wig, his face grave and sad. The child, the soldier, The bride in her tear-stained wedding gown. Dozens of them, scores of them, more than I had ever called at once, more than I had ever seen in one place. Men and women and children, servants and lords and ladies, soldiers in ancient armor and maids in homespun gowns. They filled the great hall until there was barely room to stand, their pale forms overlapping and merging, their voices rising in a cacophony of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Their faces turned toward me, their eyes glowing with a faint, otherworldly light, and I felt the weight of their attention like a physical force pressing against my chest. And then, as one, they knelt. The movement was like a wave, rippling outward from where I stood. First, the spirits nearest me, then those behind them, then those at the edges of the hall, all sinking to their knees with a grace that no living being could have matched. Their pale hands pressed to the stone floor, their heads lowered in supplication, and the whispers stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against my ears. I heard my husband make a sound beside me, a strangled gasp that might have been terror or might have been wonder. I turned to look at him and saw that he was staring, not at me, but at the ghosts. He could see them. His face was white as chalk, his eyes wide and wild, his mouth open in an expression of utter shock. He was trembling, his whole body shaking like a man caught in a seizure, and the candelabra fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor and extinguishing itself. But it did not matter. The ghosts themselves provided light, a soft, pale glow that illuminated the hall like moonlight through storm clouds. I do not know how or why he could see them. Perhaps it was the power of so many spirits gathered in one place. Perhaps it was something in the curse that bound them to this house, something that thinned the veil between the living and the dead. Perhaps it was simply that he was ready, finally, to believe. But he saw them. He saw the legion of ghosts bowing before me, their pale hands pressed to the stone floor, their heads lowered in supplication. And when he looked at me again, there was no mockery in his eyes, no coldness, no contempt. There was only awe and terror and something else, something that looked almost like reverence. "My God," he whispered, and his voice was the voice of a man whose entire world had just crumbled beneath his feet. "My God, you were telling the truth. You were always telling the truth." I took his hand, and it was trembling like a leaf in a hurricane. His fingers closed around mine with desperate strength, as though I were the only solid thing in a sea of chaos, the only anchor in a storm that threatened to sweep him away. "They are bound here," I said softly, keeping my voice steady and calm despite the pounding of my own heart. "All of them. They have been waiting for someone who could see them, who could help them. Your mother could see them, but she did not know how to help. It drove her mad with grief and frustration. But I have spent my whole life learning to live with this gift. I know how to listen to the dead. I know how to help them find peace." He looked out at the sea of spirits, at the countless faces lifted toward us in hope and supplication, and I saw the tears spilling down his cheeks. This man who had not cried since he was 8 years old, who had built walls of ice around his heart to protect himself from feeling, was weeping openly, unashamedly, before the ghosts of his ancestors and the woman he had married for a wager. "Can you help them?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the words. "Can you free them?" "I do not know," I admitted, "but I intend to find out." The ghosts remained visible to my husband for only a few minutes more before they faded back into the shadows, but it was enough. Enough to shatter the wall of denial he had built around himself, enough to break through the cold shell that had protected him since childhood. When the last spirit had faded and we stood alone in the dark hall, he sank to his knees on the cold stone floor. His head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I knelt beside him and put my arms around him, holding him as he had perhaps not been held since his mother died. He clung to me with desperate strength, his face pressed against my shoulder, his tears soaking into the fabric of my dress. And in that moment, something shifted between us. The wager, the coldness, the cruel game that had brought us together, all of it fell away, and we were simply two damaged people holding on to each other in the darkness. When the storm of his grief had passed, we made our way to his study, where the fire still burned and the brandy still waited. We sat together on the sofa before the fire, closer than we had ever been, and he told me everything. He told me about his mother, about the beautiful, fragile woman who had seen things no one else could see, who had tried so desperately to make her husband and son believe her. He told me about her laughter, her music, the way she would hold him on her lap and tell him stories of the spirits she saw, stories he had loved as a child and dismissed as fantasy as he grew older. He told me about her tears, her desperation, the way she grew thinner and paler as the years passed and no one would believe her. He told me about his father, who had loved her but could not accept what she was, who had brought doctors and priests and charlatans to cure her of her visions. He described the treatments, the bleedings and the tonics, and the long weeks of rest in darkened rooms. He described his father's face, twisted with hope and fear, as each new treatment failed and his wife slipped further and further away. He told me about the night she had walked into the sea, how he had woken to find her room empty, the window standing open to the cold November wind, how he had run to his father, who had roused the servants, who had searched the house and grounds in growing panic. How, at dawn, a fisherman had found her body on the rocks below the cliffs, her dark hair spread around her like seaweed, her face peaceful for the first time in years. He told me about his father's death, less than a year later. A hunting accident, they had said, but even at 8 years old, Sebastian had known the truth. His father had ridden into the mist and had not come back because he had not wanted to come back. Because life without Emmeline was not a life worth living, and he told me about the wager. It had seemed like a harmless bit of cruelty at the time, he said, his voice hollow with shame. We were sitting close together now, his hand in mine, the firelight playing across his face. My friends at the club were always looking for ways to shock and scandalize. When they heard about you, about the mad Ashworth girl who saw ghosts, they thought it would be amusing to see if I could tame you, make you respectable, prove that any woman could be broken to harness with enough money and authority. He paused, and I saw him swallow hard. Lord Blackstone was the one who proposed it. He is a man who delights in cruelty, who finds his pleasures in the suffering of others. He told me I could not do it, that no one could make a wife of a madwoman. And God help me. I looked at him with his smug, superior face, and I said I could. I said I would marry you within the year and keep you as my wife for 12 months, and he could pay me £1,000 when I succeeded. He looked at me, and I saw the self-loathing in his eyes, deep and raw and terrible. I accepted because I did not care, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. About you, about them, about anything. I had stopped caring years ago when my mother died. I told myself that nothing mattered, that life was just a game to be played and won. But the moment you walked into this house, the moment I saw the way the shadows seemed to lean toward you, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. You were not a pawn to be moved about a board. You were something else entirely, something I did not understand. I asked him if he regretted the wager. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said slowly, I regret the cruelty of it. I regret treating you as a prize to be won, but I cannot regret the outcome. Because if I had not made that wager, I would never have brought you here. And you, Lady Dunmorrow, are the only person alive who can help me understand what happened to my mother, the only person who can tell me whether her death was madness or murder. The word hung in the air between us. Murder, I repeated. He reached into a drawer of his desk and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. This was my mother's, he said, placing it in my hands. I found it hidden in her room after she died. I have read it 100 times, and I have never understood it. But perhaps you will. I opened the journal and began to read. The entries were fragmentary, scattered, the handwriting growing more erratic as the pages progressed. But the meaning was clear. Lady Emmeline Vane had seen the ghosts of Dunmorrow Hall. She had spoken to them, tried to help them, and she had learned the terrible truth about the curse that bound them. It began in 1743, she wrote, with a woman named Morwenna Blackwood. She was a medium, a true seer, who came to Dunmorrow Hall at the invitation of the 5th Marquess. He wanted her to contact the spirit of his dead wife, to speak to her one last time. But when Morwenna arrived, she discovered something far more terrible than a grieving widower. She discovered that the Marquess had murdered his wife, had pushed her from the cliffs in a fit of rage, and that her spirit was trapped in the house, unable to find peace. Morwenna tried to help. She performed a ritual to free the dead woman's spirit, but the Marquess discovered what she was doing. He accused her of witchcraft, of consorting with demons, and he had her executed. Before she died, she cursed him and all his descendants. She swore that the spirits of every Vane who died in this house would be bound here forever, unable to rest, and that the curse would not be broken until a living heir acknowledged the truth and made amends. I looked up from the journal, my heart pounding. "Your mother knew," I said. "She knew about the curse. She knew," my husband confirmed. "She tried to break it. She spent years researching Morwenna Blackwood, trying to find some way to undo what had been done. But in the end, it was too much for her. The ghosts were too many, their suffering too great. She could not bear it any longer." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. Or perhaps she did not choose to end her life at all. Perhaps someone pushed her, just as the 5th Marquess pushed his wife. Perhaps the curse claimed her, as it has claimed so many others. I thought of the spirits I had seen, the ones who bore the marks of violence, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who would have wanted to kill her?" I asked. My husband shook his head. "I do not know. My father was devoted to her, even when everyone else thought she was mad. He would never have harmed her. And there was no one else. Except—" He stopped, his face going pale. "Except who?" "Except my uncle," he said slowly. "My father's brother, Edmund. He stood to inherit the title if my father died without an heir. He never married, never had children of his own. He lives in the dower house at the edge of the estate, and he has always hated me. Hated my mother, too, for reasons I never understood." I set down the journal and looked at my husband, this man who had married me for a wager and was now confiding in me as though I were his closest friend. "We need to learn more about Morwenna Blackwood," I said. "We need to understand exactly what she did, what was done to her, and how the curse can be broken. If your mother was murdered, if someone in this house is willing to kill to keep the truth hidden, then we are both in danger." He met my eyes, and I saw something in his gaze that I had not seen before. Not coldness, not indifference, but determination. "Then we will learn together," he said, "and God help anyone who tries to stop us." The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. My husband and I spent our days in the vast library of Dunmorrow Hall, poring over ancient records and crumbling documents, piecing together the history of the Vane family and the woman who had cursed them. We read letters and journals and legal documents, tracing the family tree back through generations, noting patterns of tragedy and early death that might otherwise have seemed like coincidence. We spent our evenings in conversation, sharing meals and confidences, learning to trust each other in ways that neither of us had thought possible. We talked about our childhoods, our fears, our hopes for the future. We talked about the ghosts and what they wanted, about the curse and how it might be broken. We talked about everything and nothing, and slowly, imperceptibly, the walls between us began to crumble. We took walks together on the cliffs, wrapped in wool against the sea wind, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. We rode horses across the moorland, racing each other through the heather, laughing at the simple joy of movement and freedom. We sat together in the conservatory, surrounded by wild orchids and tangled vines, reading aloud to each other from the books we had found. And slowly, imperceptibly, something began to change between us. It started with small things. The way his hand would brush against mine when we reached for the same book in the library. The way he would look at me when he thought I was not watching, with an expression that was no longer cold, but searching, wondering, almost tender. The way my heart would quicken when I heard his footsteps in the corridor, when I caught the scent of his cologne on the air, when his dark eyes met mine across the dinner table. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that I was merely grateful for his belief, his partnership, his willingness to see me as something other than a madwoman. I told myself that the wager still stood between us, that he had married me for a game and would discard me when the year was done. I told myself that I could not afford to fall in love with him, that it would only lead to heartbreak. But the heart does not listen to reason. The heart wants what it wants, and mine, it seemed, had begun to want him. I caught myself watching him as he read, admiring the way the firelight played across his features, softening the hard lines of his face. I caught myself leaning closer when he spoke, hungry for the sound of his voice, for the rare and precious gift of his laughter. I caught myself dreaming of him at night, waking with his name on my lips and an ache in my chest that I could not name. And I was not the only one who was changing. The marble marquess was thawing. The ice that had surrounded him since childhood was melting, revealing the man beneath. He smiled more often now, genuine smiles that reached his eyes and transformed his face. He touched me more freely, a hand on my shoulder, a brush of his fingers against my cheek, gestures that made my skin tingle and my breath catch. He talked to me as though my opinion mattered, as though my thoughts were worth hearing, as though I were an equal partner in this strange endeavor rather than a pawn in a game. One evening, as we sat together in the library surrounded by mountains of books and papers, he looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. "I do not know what I would have done if you had not come here," he said quietly. "If I had married some simpering society miss who could not see the ghosts, who would have dismissed everything as my imagination, or, worse, run screaming back to London. You have given me something I never thought I would have. You have given me hope." I looked at him, at this man who had married me for a wager and was now looking at me as though I were the most precious thing in the world, and I felt my heart turn over in my chest. "You gave me something too," I said. "You believed me, when no one else in my entire life had believed me. You saw the ghosts and you believed. You cannot know what that means to me." He reached across the space between us and took my hand in his. His fingers were warm, his grip gentle but sure. "I think I am beginning to understand," he said, and then he raised my hand to his lips and kissed it, and I knew that I was lost. Our research bore fruit in the 5th week of our investigation. Hidden in a locked cabinet in the oldest part of the library, we found a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, addressed to the 5th Marquess in a flowing feminine hand. They were from Morwenna Blackwood. The letters told a different story than the one my husband had always believed. Morwenna had not come to Dunmorrow Hall as a stranger. She had come as a lover. The 5th Marquess had been conducting an affair with her for years, meeting her in secret, promising to marry her once his wife was dead. And when his wife had discovered the affair, when she had threatened to expose him to society, he had silenced her forever. Morwenna had loved him. Even knowing what he had done, she had loved him. And she had come to the hall believing that he would finally make good on his promises. But when she arrived, she had found only cruelty. He had used her gift to contact his wife's spirit, hoping to learn where she had hidden the evidence of his crimes. And when Morwenna had refused, when she had tried to free the dead woman instead of serving his selfish ends, he had betrayed her. The final letter was the most devastating of all. Written on the night before her execution, smuggled out of her cell by a sympathetic guard, it described the curse she intended to cast and the only way it could be broken. The blood of a vein must acknowledge the wrong, she wrote, must speak the truth before the dead and beg their forgiveness, must offer restitution to the line of Blackwood for the life that was taken. Only then will the spirits be free. Only then will the curse be lifted. I looked up from the letter to find my husband staring at me, his face ashen. "There is more," I said gently, handing him the final page. He read it in silence, and I watched the emotions play across his features. Shock, then grief, then something harder, colder. "She had a child," he said at last. "Morwenna Blackwood had a daughter, born in secret, hidden away before her arrest. A daughter who carried her blood, her gift. And the Vanes have been hunting that bloodline ever since," I finished, trying to eliminate any threat to their secret, any chance that the truth might come to light. He set down the letter and looked at me with eyes that burned. "My uncle," he said. "He is the keeper of the family records. He has spent his entire life researching our history, tracking down every scrap of information about the Vanes and their enemies. If anyone knows what became of Morwenna's descendants, it is him." "Then we must speak to him," I said. "No." He shook his head. "We must be careful. If he is the one who killed my mother, if he has been working all these years to keep the curse intact, then confronting him directly would be suicide. We need proof. We need to know exactly what he has done before we can act." I thought of the ghosts who watched me everywhere I went, the spirits who had bowed to me in the great hall. "Perhaps," I said slowly, "we do not need to confront him at all. Perhaps the dead can tell us what we need to know." That night, I performed my first true communion with the spirits of Dunmorrow Hall. I had spoken to ghosts before, had received fragments of their memories and whispers of their needs. But I had never deliberately opened myself to them, had never invited them to share their full truth with me. It was dangerous, I knew. The dead could overwhelm the living, could drown a sensitive mind in centuries of grief and rage. My husband's mother had tried, and it had destroyed her. But I was not Lady Emmeline. I had spent my whole life building walls within my mind, learning to let the dead in without losing myself. And I had something she had not had. I had a partner, a living anchor, someone to pull me back if I went too far. We gathered in the great hall at midnight, my husband and I, surrounded by candles and the musty scent of old roses. I had found a ritual in one of the library books, a method for calling the dead and requesting their testimony, and I followed it as precisely as I could, speaking the words in a clear, steady voice. The spirits came. They poured into the hall like water through a broken dam, dozens, hundreds, more than I had ever seen. Men and women and children, lords and servants, brides and soldiers and infants who had never drawn breath outside the womb. They filled the space until there was nowhere left to stand, their pale forms overlapping and merging, their voices rising in a cacophony of whispers. And then one stepped forward, a woman in a dark gown with long black hair and eyes that burned like embers. I knew her at once, though I had never seen her face. Morwenna Blackwood. "You have read my letters," she said, and her voice was like the tolling of a distant bell. "You know the truth. But there is more, so much more." She reached out and touched my forehead, and the world dissolved. I saw everything. I saw Morwenna as a young woman, beautiful and proud, discovering her gift in the cottage where she had grown up. I saw her rise to fame as a medium, consulted by the wealthy and powerful, feared and admired in equal measure. I saw her meet the 5th Marquess, fall under the spell of his charm and his lies, believe his promises of love and devotion. I saw his wife discover the affair, saw her confrontation with her husband, saw his hands close around her throat in a fit of rage. I saw her body tumble from the cliffs, saw her spirit rise and find itself trapped, bound to the house where she had lived and died. I saw Morwenna arrive at Dunmorrow Hall, see the ghost of the woman she had wronged, try to make amends. I saw the Marquess's fury when she refused to serve him, saw him summon the authorities, accuse her of witchcraft, watch as she was dragged away in chains. I saw her trial, her condemnation, her execution. I saw her cast the curse with her final breath, saw the dark power ripple outward, binding every soul in the house, living and dead. And then I saw what came after. Generation after generation of Vanes, some ignorant of the curse and some complicit, all trapped in its web. Marriages ended in tragedy. Children died before their time. Those who saw the ghosts were labeled mad and locked away. Those who tried to break the curse were silenced. I saw Lady Emmeline, my husband's mother, beautiful and gentle and determined to end the suffering. I saw her research, her rituals, her growing desperation. And I saw, on a dark November night, a figure approach her as she stood at the edge of the cliffs. Edmund Vane, my husband's uncle. He spoke to her softly, kindly, as though he were a friend offering comfort. But I saw the calculation in his eyes, the cold determination. He had been watching her for months, had seen how close she was to discovering the truth, and he had decided that she could not be allowed to succeed. He pushed her. One quick shove, and she was gone, tumbling into the darkness, her scream swallowed by the crash of the waves. And then he turned and walked back to the house, and no one ever knew. I came back to myself, gasping, tears streaming down my face, my husband's arms around me. He was calling my name, his voice raw with fear. And I clung to him as though he were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. "I know," I managed to say. "I know everything." And I told him. He listened in silence, his face growing harder and colder with every word. When I had finished, he released me and rose to his feet, and I saw something in his eyes that frightened me more than any ghost. "He is going to pay," he said, and his voice was ice. "My uncle is going to pay for what he did." I caught his hand before he could leave. "Wait," I said, "please. If you confront him now, in anger, you will give him the advantage. He has kept this secret for decades. He knows how to lie, how to deflect, how to turn accusations back on the accuser. We need to be strategic. We need to expose him in a way that he cannot escape." He looked down at me, and I saw the struggle in his face, the desire for vengeance warring against the cold logic he had cultivated all his life. "What do you suggest?" he asked at last. I took a deep breath and began to explain. The plan took weeks to prepare. My husband invited his uncle to a dinner at Dunmorrow Hall, ostensibly to introduce his new wife and discuss family matters. Edmund accepted, as I knew he would. He was too arrogant to suspect a trap, too confident in his own cleverness. In the meantime, I worked with the spirits. Morwenna had shown me the key to breaking the curse, and it was simpler than I had expected. A public acknowledgement of the crime, a sincere apology to the dead, and restitution to the Blackwood line. The first two were within my husband's power. The third required research. It took me 3 weeks to find her, Morwenna's descendant, the last of her bloodline. Her name was Clara Webb, and she lived in a small village in Cornwall, making her living as a seamstress. She had the gift, though she had never understood it. She had spent her whole life thinking she was mad. I wrote to her, explaining everything. I told her about Morwenna, about the curse, about what had been done to her ancestor. I told her that we wanted to make amends, that we would give her whatever she asked if she would come to Dunmorrow Hall and witness the breaking of the curse. Her reply arrived the day before the dinner. She would come. The night of the reckoning was clear and cold, the stars bright above the dark mass of Dunmorrow Hall. My husband greeted his uncle in the entrance hall, his manner perfect, his face betraying nothing. Edmund was a small man, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with an air of perpetual disapproval. He looked at me with thinly veiled contempt, no doubt wondering what madness had possessed his nephew to marry such a creature. We dined in the great hall, the three of us seated at the long table, surrounded by portraits of Vanes stretching back generations. The conversation was stilted, formal, my husband asking polite questions about his uncle's health and pursuits, Edmund answering with barely concealed impatience. And then, as the servants cleared the final course, my husband set down his wineglass and said, in a voice like flint, "There is something I must tell you, uncle, something I have recently discovered." Edmund's eyes narrowed. "Oh? And what might that be?" My husband rose from his chair and walked to the fireplace, his back to the room. "I know what you did to my mother," he said quietly. "I know that you pushed her from the cliffs on the night she died. I know that you have been protecting the curse that haunts this house, keeping the truth hidden so that you might one day inherit the title and the estate." The silence that followed was absolute. Edmund's face had gone pale, but his expression remained controlled. "That is a very serious accusation," he said at last. "I hope you have proof." My husband turned to face him. "I have more than proof," he said. "I have a witness." He looked at me, and I rose from my chair and walked to the center of the hall. I closed my eyes and reached out with my gift, calling to the dead as I had done so many weeks before. They came at once, eager and ready. Dozens of spirits filled the hall, their pale forms glowing with an inner light. And at their head was Lady Emmeline, my husband's mother, her dark eyes fixed on the man who had murdered her. Edmund made a sound, a strangled cry of terror, and I knew that he could see them. The curse had thinned the veil, just as it had for my husband, and now Edmund Vane was face to face with his victims. "She sees you," my husband said, his voice hard. "They all see you. And so does Clara Webb, the last descendant of Morwenna Blackwood, who has traveled here to witness your confession." A door opened at the far end of the hall, and a young woman entered. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair and dark eyes that reminded me of Morwenna's portrait. She looked at the ghosts without fear, without surprise, and I knew that she had always been able to see them. Edmund tried to run. He lunged for the door, but the spirits blocked his path, their cold hands grasping at his coat, their voices rising in a chorus of accusation. He fell to his knees, screaming, and my husband stood over him, his face pitiless. "Confess," he said. "Tell the truth, or I will leave you here with them forever." And Edmund confessed. He told us everything. How he had discovered the curse as a young man, had realized that he could use it to eliminate his rivals. How he had watched his brother's wife grow closer to the truth and decided that she had to die. How he had planned the murder for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment, pushing her from the cliffs and returning to the house as though nothing had happened. He confessed to other crimes too. Other deaths that had seemed accidental, other secrets that had been buried along with the bodies. By the time he was finished, he was weeping, broken, a shadow of the man who had entered the hall an hour before. My husband turned to me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had not expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but grief. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We break the curse," I said, "once and for all." The ritual was simple in the end. My husband stood before the assembled spirits and spoke the words that his ancestors should have spoken centuries ago. "I, Sebastian Vane, Marquess of Dunmorrow, acknowledge the crime committed by my forebear against Morwenna Blackwood and her descendants. I acknowledge the murder of the 5th Marchioness, the execution of an innocent woman, and the generations of suffering that followed. I ask forgiveness from the dead who have been trapped in this house, and I offer restitution to the Blackwood line in the form of a trust to be established in Clara Webb's name, providing for her and her descendants in perpetuity." He turned to Clara, who stood watching with tears streaming down her face. "I am sorry," he said simply, "for what was done, for the pain it caused, for the years of silence and denial. I cannot undo the past, but I can try to make the future better." Clara nodded slowly. "I forgive you," she said, "and I accept your offer." The effect was immediate. A wind swept through the hall, though no doors or windows were open. The candles flickered and flared, and the ghosts began to glow with a light that was no longer cold, but warm, golden, radiant. One by one, they began to rise. The spirits lifted from the floor like leaves caught in an updraft, their faces peaceful now, their eyes full of gratitude. Lady Emmeline drifted toward her son, and for a moment she was solid enough to cup his face in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered. And then she was gone, rising into the light, and the others followed, a river of souls finally finding their way to rest. When the last spirit had departed, the hall was silent, and I realized that for the first time since I had arrived at Dunmorrow Hall, I could not sense a single ghost. The curse was broken. In the aftermath, there were practical matters to attend to. Edmund was delivered to the authorities, his confession written and witnessed, his fate sealed. The trust for Clara was established, and she returned to Cornwall a wealthy woman, free at last from the shadow that had haunted her bloodline. And my husband and I were left alone in a house that no longer echoed with the voices of the dead. I expected him to withdraw, to return to the cold distance that had characterized our early days. The wager was no longer relevant. The ghosts were gone. There was no reason for us to remain anything more than strangers who happened to share a name. But he did not withdraw. Instead, he came to me on the night after Edmund's arrest, finding me in the library where I had spent so many hours researching the curse. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching me with an expression I could not read, and then he crossed the room and knelt beside my chair. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "Not just for the wager, though, that was unforgivable. I owe you an apology for every cold word, every dismissive look, every moment I treated you as less than you are. You saved this house, you saved me, and I have done nothing to deserve it." I looked down at him, at this man who had married me for a game and had become something so much more, and I felt my heart clench. "You believed me," I said, "when no one else would. You stood beside me and faced the ghosts and never once flinched. That is worth more than any apology." He took my hand, and his touch was warm now, no longer the cold marble I remembered. "I am falling in love with you," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something, seemed to crack open the last of his defenses. "I do not know when it started or how it happened, but it is true. I love you, Isolde. Not because of what you can do, but because of who you are. The bravest, most extraordinary woman I have ever known." I wanted to speak, wanted to tell him that I felt the same, but the words would not come. Instead, I leaned forward and kissed him, and he kissed me back, and for the first time since I was 12 years old, I felt truly seen. We were married again, 3 months later, in a ceremony far different from the first. The church was filled with flowers, and Clara Webb stood beside me as my witness. And when my husband spoke his vows, his voice was steady, and his eyes never left mine. There was no wager this time, no cold contract, no bitter bargain. There was only love, freely given and freely received, and the knowledge that we had earned it, both of us, through fire and darkness and the long road to redemption. Dunmorrow Hall is quiet now. The ghosts are gone, the curse is broken, and the great old house has begun to feel like a home rather than a prison. My husband and I walk its corridors together, exploring the rooms we never dared enter before, filling the empty spaces with light and laughter and hope. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I think I catch a glimpse of something at the edge of my vision, a flicker of movement, a whisper of sound. But when I turn to look, there is nothing there. The dead have found their rest, and I am finally free to live. I am no longer the mad Ashworth girl, the pariah, the outcast. I am Lady Dunmorrow, mistress of a great house, wife of a man who loves me, seer of spirits who no longer need my sight. I have found my place in the world, and it is here, in this haunted hall that is haunted no more, with the man who married me for a wager and stayed for love. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the moon is full, I stand at the window of my bedroom and look out at the sea where Lady Emmeline died, and I whisper a prayer of thanks. for the gift that was once my curse, for the man who believed me when no one else would, for the chance to make something beautiful out of something broken. This is my story, the story of a madwoman and a marquess, of ghosts and curses and impossible redemption. It is not the story I expected to live, but it is the story I was meant to tell, and it is, against all odds, a love story. I know now that the dead do not always leave us. Sometimes they linger, bound by grief or rage or unfinished business. But sometimes, if we are brave enough to face them, if we are strong enough to hear their truth, they can teach us how to live. My husband taught me that. Sebastian, the marble marquess, the man who thought he was incapable of feeling, who built walls around his heart so high that even he could not see over them. He taught me that love is not weakness, that vulnerability is not madness, that the bravest thing we can do is let someone see us as we truly are. And I taught him that ghosts are real, that the things we cannot see are not always imaginary, that sometimes the most impossible things are the most true. We saved each other in the end. He gave me belief, and I gave him redemption. We broke the curse together, and in doing so, we broke the curses we had placed on ourselves. I am 30 years old as I write this, the mother of 2 children who have inherited their grandmother's dark eyes and, perhaps, something of my gift. I have not seen a spirit since the night the curse was broken, but I watch my children carefully, looking for signs that they can see what I once saw. If they can, I will not do what my father did. I will not send them away, will not label them mad, will not break their hearts with disbelief. I will hold them close and tell them the truth and teach them how to use their gift wisely. My husband stands behind me as I write, his hand on my shoulder, reading over my shoulder as he always does. He has changed so much since the day we met, and yet he is still the same man underneath, still sharp, still proud, still capable of cutting wit when the occasion demands it. But the coldness is gone, burned away by the fire we walked through together. "I love you," he says, bending to press a kiss to my hair. "I know," I reply, and I set down my pen and turn to face him. The children are asleep. The house is quiet. Outside, the sea churns against the cliffs, eternal and uncaring, and the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. We are home. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know if the gift will return to me, if more ghosts will find their way to my door, if the peace we have found will last. But I know this: whatever comes, I will face it with him. The man who married me for a wager and discovered that some things cannot be measured in pounds or pennies. The man who saw the impossible and chose to believe. The man who knelt before me, not because the ghosts demanded it, but because his heart did. Sebastian Vane, my husband, my love, my home. And if someday the dead come calling again, I will be ready. Because I am no longer the girl who cowered in an asylum, terrified of her own mind. I am no longer the pariah who hid in shadows, waiting for the world to notice her. I am Isolde Vane, Marchioness of Dunmorrow, and the dead bow to me. Not because I am mad, because I am powerful, because I am worthy, because I see, and that, in the end, is all any of us truly want. To be seen, to be believed, to be loved not in spite of our strangeness, but because of it. I have found all of that in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected man, and I will be grateful for it every day of my life. This is my story. It is finished now, but the living goes on. The living and the loving and the slow, steady work of building a future from the ashes of the past. Dunmorrow Hall stands sentinel above the sea, its windows bright with candlelight, its halls filled with laughter and warmth. The curse is broken, the ghosts are at peace, and I, who was once the mad Ashworth girl, have become exactly what I was always meant to be: loved, believed, home. And that is the greatest gift of all.